Hello and welcome to the Futurist Letters show. My name is Cairo Smith. I am the founder and editor-in-chief of Futurist Letters, the journal. I am also the host of the Futurist Letters podcast, which you are watching and or listening to right now. Today I am joined by my stalwart co-host Kenny. Hi, Kenny.
Hey, what's up, Cairo?
Very glad to have you here. And today on the show, we have Kamil Kazani. He is a historian and a very interesting thinker, and we are very glad to be talking to him about all sorts of geopolitical goings on. And I'm sure the conversation will lead in fascinating and unexpected directions. So, that being said, Kamil, thank you very much for coming on the show. And for those who don't already know who you are, would you tell us a little bit about you and what you do?
So thank you so much for inviting me. My name is Kamil. I'm originally from Russia. I'm a historian, and I have been most publicly and perhaps best publicly known for covering the Russian-Ukrainian war since its very beginnings. At this moment, I'm primarily interested in the nature of power, in the sociology of power, and specifically in the phenomenon of revolution. So basically how it happens, technically speaking.
Nice. I definitely want to ask you more questions about revolution and the nature of power. I've been reading your essays as they come out. But first, maybe if you don't mind, we talk about the Ukraine war. So, I have a few questions about it. And as an American, not just an American, but someone who lives in Hawaii, where Russia and Ukraine are extremely far away. I don't claim to understand it, but it is one of the most, probably the most consequential conflict of the 21st century so far. But I feel like I don't really know what this war is really about. I've heard a bunch of different stories and versions of explanations about why this is happening. Like, is Russia trying to secure their old empire? Is it about Russia defending itself from NATO? Is it about, defending Russian or Ukrainian speaking people from genocide? These are all different explanations I've heard. I don't know really what to make of it. So, in your mind, why is this war happening in the first place?
First, I totally agree with you. I think you made one very important observation, and perhaps it's important not only regarding like Russia or Ukraine, but also regarding like other regions of the globe. That sort of the globe it's separated into various like cultural linguistic spaces, which are perhaps not totally untransparent, but largely untransparent to each other. So, I mean, for example, if for an American, it can be, for example, Russia and Ukraine, and there may be a lot of knowledge which is absolutely obvious for a Russian, Ukrainian, or a Belarusian, but that is totally enigma for Americans. For Russians, it can be very often, I don't know, realities of Turkmenistan or Uzbekistan, and like there are some realities of situation on the ground, which are absolutely like obvious to locals, but nobody in Moscow ever heard about that. Like total mystery. Or perhaps China. So yes, indeed, there is a lot of like whatever we hear or whatever we understand about like other far off regions, it can be it can often miss details of context, which can very often be absolutely apparent to the people on the ground. So yeah, that is very often what happens. So regarding Russia and Ukraine, I think good place to start would be to introduce maybe into a few basics that, from my perspective, are not very well covered by each side of the American internal discourse. So, for example, one common argument of Russia and Russian leadership and those perhaps of American commanders who sort of like sympathetic to it is like presenting the war as a defense of Russian speakers in Ukraine. So what does it refer to? So kind of what is the implicit assumption behind that? That there is a country of Ukraine, Ukrainian speaking, that it has a Russian minority, and this minority has been abused, and it is now being defended by Russia. And interestingly enough, this just model of the world is completely untrue, but neither side of debate, no Republicans, no Democrats, no pro-Russian, no anti-Russian advocacy are really interested in what I consider to be like more accurate and truer picture. And true picture is Russia is mostly Russian-speaking country. Like obviously there are ethnic minorities, but mostly everyone is speaking Russian. Ukrainian is mostly a Russian-speaking country. So effectively, when I say it's Russian-speaking, obviously it's not 100% truth, it's bilingual. But overall, of two languages that are most prominent in Ukraine, actually Russian is more widespread. There are pretty much everyone in Ukraine can converse in Russian, but not 100% of Ukrainians speak Ukrainian. And when I say this, I don't mean like in ethnic terms or in cultural terms. So, for example, to put it another way, when we look at Ireland or Scotland, we understand that everyone there speaks English, but only a small minority actually speaks Scottish Gaelic or like Irish Gaelic. That does not mean they are not really Irish. That does not mean they are really Scottish. But it would be completely false to say that there is some kind of English minority in Scotland. No, everyone in Scotland speaks English. Absolutely everyone. Everyone in Ireland does. It's like rather Irish or Scottish Gaelic speakers who are a small minority. And in Ukraine, it's not as extreme. It's not as extreme. But fundamentally, by the time Ukraine got independent, Russian language has been obviously dominant there, like extremely dominant. And that means that the very discourse about like Russian minority, which can be treated well or can be mistreated, it's not factually speaking true, because like Russian speaking community, I think it's like 100% of Ukrainians or like nearly 100. Moreover, it's even funnier than that. So if we look at distribution of political power, so basically who were presidents, who were prime ministers, who in the government, so who held all the highest position in state in Ukraine? Mostly and disproportionately, these were people from the east of the country. So these were people from regions who are closer to Russia. And I think in many cases, these are people who learned Ukraine, but learned to speak Ukraine properly in adult age. And that is completely normal in eastern regions. So I know what I'm talking about sounds paradoxical, but reality, I would say the following. By the time Ukraine got independent, Russian culture was dominant in most of the regions, especially in the eastern part of the country. I would say it was bilingual country where Ukrainian speakers were minority. And in reality, it were Russian speakers, and I would say like native Russian speakers, who hold most of sway, like politically, administratively, economically. And that's just how it is. So, for example, if you look at current president, well, he's coming from Russian-speaking East. I have a reason to believe that he learned Ukrainian later in life, which is again completely normal there. So the whole narrative we're hearing is not exactly true, but again, the side and neither advocacy is really interested in disproving it. Russian advocacy is not interested in disproving it because it kind of breaks the entire narrative about like Russian speakers being oppressed. They cannot be oppressed if they're 100% of the country. And Ukrainian advocacy is not interested in that because it can kind of give ground to pro-Russian advocacy. So if everyone is speaking Russian, it does not, so it can be potentially interpreted as dangerous because it kind of gives legitimacy to Russian involvement. So there is a paradox. And that, I would say,
So
a
it's
great
almost like
line.
it's like a lie that both sides
No one is
want
talking
to
about.
believe. Oh, sorry. It just sounds like it's a lie that both sides want to believe. You can probably find analogs in American conflicts like that as well.
I would say not so much lies, but like a blind spot. A blind spot. And again, I'm not when I'm saying that everyone spoke Russian, but only a few spoke Ukrainian. It also should be understood in the context, and the context is. Let's be realistic. For example, in the Russian Empire, in the USSR, if you want to make any sort of career at all, you would be like much better off with Russian because that's the language of officialdom, that is the language of the state, that is the language that's primarily taught. And fundamentally, by the time Ukraine got independent, what you had, even in central regions of the country, for example, very commonly, it is that there is Ukrainian language still remaining in the village, in the countryside. But many of the cities, including in the center, by that point, they're 100% Russian. So what you had in Ukraine in post-independence years, it's pretty systematic and pretty massive effort, like both by the state and by the intelligentsia and by the literati. It's to reinstall the Ukrainian language, to reinstall the Ukrainian culture, and to like return it back. So yeah.
And this is a sort of friction, I imagine, even if, say, everybody in Ukraine pretty much speaks Russian, if there's this effort to revive, or you've seen this, I mean, this has happened with Hebrew, this has happened with a lot of cultures where sort of in the process of nation building, a language is revived and pushed, say like in the state curriculum. Is that what's causing tension with these people in eastern Ukraine who want to remain more culturally Russian and not participate in this Ukrainianization or whatever you might call it?
I would say that parallel with Hebrew, it's not very relevant here because of Hebrew by the 20th century, it was pretty much dead. It was actually revived from the dead. With Ukrainian, it was never the case. It never really died. It kind of lost in prestige. It lost in kind of cultural pedigree. But it always remained just mostly in the countryside. So it existed more like lower status language, but it never really died. I would give another parallel. I would give another parallel that may be
Please.
useful, I think. I would give another parallel. Kazakhstan. So Kazakhstan, it's largely Muslim, Turkic Republic, to the southeast from Russia. Interesting thing about Kazakhs speak language like very close to my native language, to the Tatar, and they are Sunni Muslims. By the time Kazakhstan got independent, or after the collapse of the USSR, I will not give you an exact figure, but very significant number of Kazakhs, very significant, did not speak Kazakh. So you had tons and tons of people, especially in the regions closer to Russia, that spoke only Russian exclusively. And what happened since then is that Kazakh state, and again intelligentsia and literati, it took a massive effort kind of reviving Kazakh language again and kind of returning it. And yes, maybe sort of artificially. So for example, what you have in Kazakhstan is that very often elderly generation, especially in the north closer to Russia, speaks only Russian exclusively, while the youngsters speak Kazakh too. Why? Because they're taught by the state. But that is again massive orchestrated effort of their recent decades.
Right.
And yes, one important thing here and one interesting thing is that I have a reason to believe that obviously Moscow and Russian state did not take these efforts very lightly in both cases. So I think that Kazakhs, when they're doing this effort and kind of returning Kazakh language and stuff, they kind of were afraid and they suspected that yes, that absolutely may lead to the war with Russia, potentially. So that was the risk they were taking in mind. And that was the reason why, for example, this returning Kazakh language, it mostly focused on village. Because probably their line of thinking was like this. If we do it in the cities where like actual ethnic Russians live, we just, it can actually lead to war, it can lead to invasion. So, but what we do is that we revive Kazakh in the village, and when people from village come to the city, that kind of happens like more organically. But yes, I believe that Kazakh elites and Kazakh government, it understood that every attempt at this sort of linguistic revival, it has a grain of possibility of military conflict.
But at this moment, Russia obviously is at war with Ukraine and not at war with Kazakhstan. So what is it about the Ukraine situation that has led to this conflict in your view? I'd be curious to know.
I think one reason is because Russians and Ukrainians are so similar. So what does it mean? That means that so when we talk about foreign relations, we often talk it in terms of like government to government relations. But there is like more fundamental and often more important layer, I would say, of society to society that is kind of getting overlooked. Because in reality, humans are mimetic. Humans, they're not very original. They always imitate each other. They kind of get infected with each other's ideas and patterns, and very easily. So, but that happens, and happens much easier when people are kind of similar, when they're culturally similar, when they kind of consider each other a reference group. The thing with Kazakhstan, or for example with countries of Central Asia, is that Russians do not really consider them as a reference group. They do not really consider Kazakhs or Uzbeks or Kyrgyz as one of their own. So for example, if someone happens in Kyrgyzstan, for example, a revolution, government getting overthrown, it's not like that makes some great impression in Russia. It's not like people in Moscow, oh, we should do the same, because they don't care at all. They are completely different people of different ethnicity who look Asian, who are Muslim, and Russians do not really care. With Ukraine, it's different. Fundamentally, and until this war, Russians did not really consider Ukraine as different people. So, I mean, now Ukraine and Russia are becoming two separate nations, but it's like becoming right now. Before that wasn't the case. And that means that any political development in Ukraine, it would cause a direct impact on Russia, a direct impression. And for example, that is the reason I think 2014 and the political developments of 2014, I think that was the real cause of Russian invasion originally. Because for Putin, for Russian government, if Ukraine is allowed to do that, basically, if you can just kind of overthrow your president, if you can overthrow your government, and that is okay, then basically that means it's okay in Russia too, and they cannot allow that.
And this seems like the sort of the wedge for pro-Russian versus pro-Ukraine thought is, how do you think 2014 was legitimate? Euromaidan, do you think that this was essentially an unjust coup, or was this a reflection of popular sentiment? And I guess that gets right into what you study, right? The legitimacy of revolutions and how they occur. Kenny, I want to toss it back to you, though, because I know you have a lot you want to get into.
I guess from the standpoint of the Ukraine war, like if you were America, like what would you advise like America do in this situation? Do we do nothing? Do we take an active role? Do we side with the Russians, side with the Ukrainians? What should America be doing?
So answering the first question and answering the legitimacy, well, honestly, I think legitimacy, it like belongs more like to the realm of like political theology than of mechanics. So it's kind of indivisible from like which side are you staying. So basically you are always like whatever side I belong to obviously is legitimate to me. I mean, like, it's maybe cynical answer, but that's how it is. I was in Kiev, like, in the time of, like, when it was happening in February 2014. Obviously, I cannot vouch for the entire country. And obviously, I cannot, like, say for the entire society. What I can observe and what I can say with certainty is that it was the events and basically, like, the demonstrations, the protests against then existing government. They're pretty popular in the capital. So in Kiev, in the capital, they were popular. That was obvious. And I think very often, especially in more centralized countries, that is the only thing that matters. So, for example, when we are talking about some potential political havoc in Russia, well, Russia as a whole does not matter, but Moscow does. So that is the only place where really politics happen. So
that's interesting. That's very different than America. It reminds me of, like the Ivory Coast or Nigeria, or there are a lot of countries where the capital is everything, and I think in the US we might be a little more unique in how spread out the power is.
Yes, and if you got the real, like, capital, in a sense in which, like, Moscow is capital or Kiev is capital, that will make your political structure very much more fragile. Very much more fragile. Because that means, like, when it's very centralized, it means that the entire political structure can be basically taken out in one blow. Because in Russia, if you control Moscow, that's it. That's it. But in the United States, there is not this like single center of power which just gives orders to everyone. Like DC is not to the same degree. So that means that the US power is much more stable. And that is the reason you cannot have a revolution.
That's very interesting. I think that could be a whole episode in and of itself. But I guess getting back, well, I'm sure that anyone listening to this is curious, especially with you being Russian yourself, to know how you feel about the war. Is it something that you find yourself, emotionally invested in one side, or do you prefer to study it more analytically, with distance?
Well, just one thing, I just need to make a disclaimer, because I'm from Russia. I'm a Russian national, and also I'm ethnic minority, so I'm Tatar. And so I'm Sunni Muslim. I'm Turkic speaking. And yes, I think that absolutely does like inform my position and like my stance and my decisions. So am I involved in that emotionally? Obviously, yes. And for a number of reasons, for quite a while. Obviously, the whole policy of kind of expansion and Moscow's involvement into Ukraine, I found it quite irritating. So starting from 2014, I was a bit angry about that all because I thought, I didn't know like this war of this scale is coming. Eventually, it became a surprise to me. But overall, I just did not like it because I thought it's kind of some stupid mess, and it's kind of bringing it all to some kind of stupid mess. I think, can I find like, for example, were I a Russian nationalist? Then perhaps I would have found it that overall it makes complete sense. So like we're like Russian people, and we're adding more Russian people into like the entire kind of collecting our lands and our people. But I'm not looking from this perspective. Although I must notice that quite likely, the very idea that like Russia and Ukraine are basically the same ethnicity, the same people, I think it played a significant role not only like in provoking the war, but also in kind of laying its specific scenario for why it worked out as it worked out. Because I think that Putin and Russian political leadership, obviously they did not prepare for long war. Obviously not. Because no one plans to fight for many years some kind of World War I battles for some coal mines of Donbass. That wasn't the plan. I believe that the plan was, we are really one people. So what we do, basically, we just enter forcefully, and then nobody's gonna shoot in us, really. And we kind of take control over it with relatively little bloodshed and very quickly. So in a kind of tour de force. I think that had been the original plan. But to their great surprise, and I think they did not believe in that, they did not expect that, Ukrainian troops, Ukrainian army actually started offering resistance, actually started fighting back. And basically that's how the very slow and the very bloody war started. And interestingly enough, one and perhaps maybe the most significant result of this war is that Russia and Ukraine are actually becoming two separate nations, are actually becoming two separate peoples. So some kind of breakup, mental breakup, they did not really happen after the collapse of the USSR. It is happening right now. Because when you are killing each other, when you are slaughtering each other, when you are shooting at each other, the longer it goes, the less you really kind of feel any sort of, unity at all with people on the other side. So were Russians and Ukrainians two completely separate peoples before this war? No. Will they be two separate peoples after this war? Yes.
Who is winning in your view, and what do both sides realistically think they could potentially gain?
You see, when people are talking about winning in war, they often kind of imply that this is sort of like a game like, like poker, so a zero-sum game. I won $100, that means you lost $100. But
it seems like a very negative sum game in this case to me.
Yes, this is negative sum game. That means that both sides can absolutely lose in their own way. Is Russia winning? No. What Russia wanted? Russia wanted to make a swift demonstration of power, to change regime in Ukraine, to change it quickly, and with relatively like little bloodshed. That was the original plan. And then kind of integrate Ukraine with Russia, kind of bring the lost tribe of Israel, basically. Bring the lost tribe back. That was the idea. And why it was important, among other things, because kind of East Slavic, Russian population of Russia would increase by like 1/3. And the overall demographic, economic, military potential would become very much like greater. So you basically increase purely Russian population of Russia by 1/3. All of that collapsed. And not only that will not happen now, obviously, but Ukrainians, as a result of this, became completely unintegratable. Like now, even like Russian state, Russian officialdom, Russian population generally will obviously look at them with a great degree of suspicion. So if before the war, like Russian state wanted to incorporate Ukrainians, now I think it is increasingly being seen like, is it really of any benefit? So in this regard, Russian goals and like Russian original plan, they completely collapsed. And moreover, if we look at their most, I would say, Russian parts of Ukraine, that is of course like its eastern parts, which probably had the least, let's say, Ukrainians in them, and which are the most Russians, especially like parts of Donbass, they're just turned into dust. So the parts of Ukraine that had been the most Russian, they're completely obliterated as a result of this war. Now there are like only ruins and maybe some kind of pensioners that have nowhere to go. So the most Russian part of Ukraine, it is that part that being absolutely obliterated, like pulverized. So for Russia, I think it's defeat. I think obviously it's defeat and very bad defeat. So Russia got into a bloody mess. Russia miscalculated. The entire regional calculation was wrong. And what I think now Russian leadership is doing, it's kind of trying to score something that can be considered a victory, because it does not want to accept a loss, but it wants to show something, which is not easy to do. Regarding Ukraine, on the one hand, obviously it like won greatly in terms of prestige, in terms of like international standing, in terms of reputation. How will they recover after this war demographically and economically? I honestly don't understand.
In order to understand Russia, I feel like it's really helpful to understand Stalin and that period of Russia from the end of the monarchy, the beginning of the Bolsheviks, and then accumulating with Stalin. And you've written some really great essays about Stalin in your Substack. What do you think Americans or Westerners, people outside of Russia, basically misunderstand the most about Stalin? Like, what should we know that we don't know? Like, what's our like? Where's our blind spot when it comes to this guy? Because the way you write about him is very different from how I've heard other people describe him.
So, if I were to summarize in one sentence, what should Americans know or understand about Stalin? I would say the following. Stalin is a ruler who behaved perfectly rationally. So he was a very smart guy, really intelligent guy, who behaved absolutely logically, absolutely rationally, in terms of like first seizing power, concentrating power, and then solidifying power. So, interestingly enough, that was not, I think, his only like exclusively his like intuitive ideas or intuitive understanding. I think it was also a result of much like theoretical work. So he was reading like authors like Machiavelli. So he was kind of like working on them, trying to analyze. He was doing a lot of like empirical research. I remember I loved one episode from Montefiore's book on Stalin. So basically, when there is some party going on, and Stalin is not participating in party, he's lying on sofa and reading book. So his friend asking him what he's reading. He answers, I am reading Memoirs of Napoleon. I'm trying to understand what did he do wrong. So it was pretty intelligent guy who was kind of studying theory, who was studying like lives of others like Napoleon. Where did Napoleon fuck up? And who approached this very rationally. And what he did, what he concluded, was basically that you should kill all independent people and all the past elites, absolutely obliterate them. Consider Napoleon. How did Napoleon lose in the end? Well, he was basically, when he got defeated in Russia, he got abandoned by his own allies, his own vassals, and eventually, basically, by his own appointees in the French government. They all ran away from him. And Stalin be like, so you should kill them all. And in this regard, I think everything he did was absolutely logical, absolutely rational, and in the long run, it caused an absolutely detrimental and degrading effect on the whole society. So the whole society, the whole culture, as a result of Stalin, it became very much worse.
It seems like, say, even if, he acted rationally to secure his power, to remove threats to his power, successfully remained in power until the end of his life. Even if you say, okay, Stalin succeeded in achieving all his goals, clearly there's this massive change away from Stalinism that occurs after his death. What did Russia, one must assume Russia did not continue on the way that he intended after Stalin died. So why did he, in that sense, fail to set up a system that would continue Stalinism after Stalin?
Well, a short and simple answer to that would be because his own servants, who executed his policies, who kind of were like kissing his hands and doing everything he said, because they hated him. They hated like absolutely everything. And the moment he died, they were like free to do whatever they want. So like if you think that people like in Stalin's government, that his own ministers like loved him, no, obviously they hated him. And that's
Right.
interesting because that kind of shows like the contradictory nature of power. You know, like I don't remember like ancient Greek author, maybe Aristotle, maybe not, I forgot, who wrote that you have as many enemies as you have slaves. So for Stalin, everyone around was slave, and they hated him.
And as such, everyone was an enemy. Yeah, I suppose it's a recurring theme with these people who are very good at seizing power. You know, you have Alexander. You have when you're such an autocrat, the system doesn't really survive after you. You know, like it's hard to build continuity in a cult of personality. Do you see, just to connect it to the present day? Do you see Putin preparing for a retirement or a transition away from himself? How do you think that's going to go?
You see, the problem with systems like Russian is that it does not allow for a smooth transition of power. It's very hard to do. And that is very easy to show. So, for example, why do you hold political power in the US? Because you won elections. And if you lose elections, you stop holding power. Why do you hold power in absolute monarchy? Well, because you are the eldest son of the king. In Russia, it's kind of a lot of some hybrid variant. So kind of you hold power because you hold power. And technically speaking, anyone can replace you. So, which means that your position is in some respects it's less secure. And one thing you cannot do, you cannot name a successor. Because if you name a successor and say, he's my successor, he's like, he will succeed me. And people believe in this. Everyone basically flocks to him and will start obeying his orders now. So the moment you do this, you like immediately start losing too much of your power. And that means there is a great chance, that should Putin, which all is possible, just die naturally, it's quite possible that there will be no mechanism of succession like prepared at all.
How did Boris Yeltsin successfully transfer power to Putin? And it seems like it worked out fairly well for him and his family. Like I'm not an expert in Russian history, but it seems like Yeltsin did okay after Putin became president. What did he do differently, or what was different about Russian society in that moment that made that a fairly atypical, smooth transfer of power? Or was
Yeah.
it not that smooth?
What was different about Yeltsin? Great question. First, I think what was different about Yeltsin is that he was, the country was in deep crisis. It was like on the very bottom of crisis in every respect, like economically, like politically. Yeltsin by that point was extremely unpopular. And he was also heavy alcoholic who was taking medicines that were incompatible with alcohol and still drinking, which means that he could have died just at every moment. And should that happen, his entire family and his clan are absolutely doomed. Absolutely doomed. So basically, to save his family, to save his kin, to save his daughter, he basically had to hand power to someone who will not betray him. And I think the point with Putin is that Yeltsin was like half disabled by that point, and he needed to hand power to someone. But the problem was to find a grateful man. They could not find a grateful man. And when they saw a person who had a reputation for being grateful to his old bosses and kind of not forgetting about them, they just immediately handed him everything. And that happened very quickly. I mean, you were asking how transition of power to Putin happened very fast, in a blink of an eye. So that is kind of paradoxical, but like in summer 1999, he's just an obscure official no one knows at all. He becomes prime minister, and then Yeltsin hands him power in just like 3 or 4 months. So like part of the answer is everyone was in shock. No one believed in that. So I remember I read a memoirs of one of Yeltsin's like chief of staff in Kremlin, and basically one of big bosses, one of like big regional bosses, he was like visiting Yeltsin, and they were talking. And Yeltsin told him that there's this young guy, Putin, at this point completely unknown. You should join his political party. And that like regional boss be like, why? Why I should like go to some no-names party? completely unknown, obscure young guy. And Yeltsin kind of conveying him the thought that he should, and he's like finding some pretext not to. Eventually, Yeltsin got tired. He said, in a few weeks, I'm going to appoint him as a prime minister. And in several months, I'm going to step down and he'll become the next president. Do with this information whatever you want. And left. And that regional boss he was talking to, he was in complete shock. He just didn't believe in that. So just from his perspective, it was like taking some random guy from the street and like handing him everything. He just did not imagine it was possible. So part of the reason may be until the very last moment, nobody believed something like that could even happen.
It seems like Yeltsin figured out, you said that you can't choose your successor in Russia because then everyone will start to rally around the successor. Maybe Yeltsin figured it out. You just have to do it at the very last second with somebody that no one expected, so they can't predict who it's going to be, and then you leave very quickly after you pick.
I think I agree with you. And that is maybe one difference between Putin and Yeltsin. Yeltsin, actually, unlike Putin, he was naturally very risk-taking, very aggressive, and like very forceful personality. He was just living through very hard times and through difficult times. But Putin is actually much more cautious.
Yeah, that makes sense. Plus, I guess Putin at the time, it wasn't probably a foregone conclusion that he was going to be able to consolidate power. And so when he first became president, probably Yeltsin was not at the top of his list of people that he needed to deal with and subjugate. So Yeltsin probably was, if he was able to be an asset to Putin in the moment that Putin's consolidating power, probably gave him some kind of credible commitment device out of Putin that hey, this guy's probably not going to come after me, at least not right away, because he's going to have bigger problems on his plate than me and my family.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think this too, but I think also by that point, Putin was 40-something years old, and he already had a reputation, like a person who cares about his friends and doesn't abandon his friends. A person who, when his former boss was accused of corruption, he basically organized his escape to France from the law enforcement. So I think that was the real quality Yeltsin was seeking for. And in this regard, he was kind of right, because look at Yeltsin's family. Nothing happened to them. They kept their position, they kept their wealth. Putin's friends, they're all billionaires. So yeah, you have a person who is highly loyal to his personal circle of friends and acquaintances. So in this regard, Yeltsin's calculation was absolutely correct.
I'm curious because after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a moment for Americans, at least in American culture, where you had this, Francis Fukuyama feeling, this sort of end of history where Americans were thinking, oh, we're all going to be Western-style liberal nations now. Even, maybe the US and Russia will be allies in stopping terrorism or whatever it was. You look at the movie Air Force One, which is this post-Soviet thing, and the Russians and the Americans are working together to stop the terrorists. But I look at a lot of Russian propaganda and YouTube videos, things, especially from after the start of the Ukraine war, and it seems to me like some Russians, feel like NATO and the US are this very existential threat, like they're backed in a corner, like the US is this very, very dangerous enemy pushing down on them. Is that something that most Russians feel? How do they see the West these days?
Great question. I think actually, you raised several themes. Regarding the end of history, yes, I think that was very common feeling among almost everyone in the early 1990s. Retrospectively speaking, of course, it was a mistake, because I think history never ends. So if there is anything permanent, is that there is nothing permanent. So there is no how Kipling wrote, our pomp of yesterday is that of Nineveh and Tyre. So basically, referring the glory of Assyrian Empire, of Phoenicians past, so that the glory of British Empire will pass. So I think if there is anything permanent, if that just orders and empires and ideologies that just come and go, that's how it is. Regarding the NATO, I think there is very complex feeling in Russia. Obviously, there are like people of different feelings, of different beliefs, of different like ideologies. But I think it's a little bit more complex than what you said. There is, of course, one idea that is somehow a threat or whatever, and there is another which I would characterize as the feeling of maybe being offended or insulted, that kind of we were not accepted into the club. So basically, if I were to summarize like Russian grievance toward the West and to the America, and I'm not saying if it's right or wrong, I'm just saying what the grievance is, it would probably be you kinda made us believe we'll be invited to the Cool Kids Club, but eventually we did not receive the invitations to the Cool Kids Club. So now we are going to show you. I think that would be a much more honest description of the actual grievance. Because eventually, very few believe that like American troops will be like marching on Moscow or whatever. That's pretty fringe. But the grievance about like not being invited or not being accepted is very real.
Right. That makes sense. I remember reading as a teenager that in the late 40s, Russia applied to join NATO, which I thought was very funny. And I guess was not accepted. But yeah, sorry. Kenny, let's knock through some more of what you wanted to get into with the time that we have.
All right. So one thing that's been on my mind and probably been on quite a few liberals in the U.S.'s mind since Trump won his presidency is the nature of coups and the transition. You know, how do democracies end and turn into authoritarian dictatorships? And you wrote a really interesting essay. Basically, the gist of it, if I can try and paraphrase and summarize it, is like a prerequisite to a successful military coup is usually that like the military has already been invited and incorporated into politics. And usually, what happens is you have rival factions of elites, political elites, that use the military to settle scores between each other, and that leads to a snowball effect where eventually the military is the people in the military become de facto political elites, and that enables them to seize power. When you were writing that essay, certainly you must have been thinking about Trump in the United States, whether you think a political coup is imminent or not, or even if it's sort of impossible. What do you think about?
I think that the United States may be indeed like surviving its sort of transition from republic to empire. That's very possible. But also, I believe they're on the relatively early stage of this transition. So, why I think so? Because I traveled relatively well around the world and observed a broad range of political regimes. Maybe the United States did like 2 or 3 steps towards becoming like a regime more like Russia, but there is like 200 steps ahead. So I mean, like you can become more like Russia politically, but you have a lot of job to do yet. So because how do these regimes actually look like? Is that the country is very centralized. All the power is in the capital, in the central government, and everyone are based to that government. You cannot really, and you kind of used to obedience to it. And then it's very easy to kind of build top-down vertical political structure with one great boss on the top. At this point, you just did not have preconditions for like true autocracy or true like regime like Putin's, for example. For example, there is a lot of like distribution of power. States have a lot of authorities, a lot of like local regional powers. I mean, the military have very little participation in the overall governance so far. So, and although I believe that some practices of security state and surveillance state, they are being imported domestically, specifically in the process of the global war on terror, I still think it's probably like stage 1.
I would be curious to know, thinking about these things with a US lens, because I know you study revolutions, and I suppose what I want to ask is, how do you see the relationship between a revolution where the capital is overthrown, like the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, versus something that's more like a secession? like the American Revolution, or I guess the American Civil War was an attempted secession, where there's a chunk that's trying to create its independence. Is that a kind of revolution, or is that something different?
You see, terms can be often misleading because, like, the term war can actually mean like a lot of stuff and like completely different stuff. In this case, why I'm referring when I say revolution to Russia or to France? Because let's be honest, when generally speaking, people, maybe in other countries, not America, but when they say revolution, they usually mostly mean something like top-down phenomenon, something like what happened in France in the 18th century or in Russia in the early 20s. That is what usually people keep in mind. And what happened in
Right.
America, it's much more, I would say, like War of Independence.
Yes, that's an interesting distinction to draw. Um, I guess you could also have something like, say, if you look at the Vietnam War, on one hand, you could have the North Vietnamese, Ho Chi Minh, calling this a war of independence from colonial powers. But if you look at the South Vietnamese government as being a legitimate, then it is also kind of a revolution in the sense of deposing the South Vietnamese. It just depends on how you look at it.
Well, I think in this kind of stuff, whoever wins in the end is considered legitimate. That's how it usually is. But
Right.
I agree with you, like that regional lenses is really helpful in this regard, because my understanding is that not only the South Vietnamese government, it kind of like lost, but also it looks to me as if South Vietnamese communists also lost. Because in the end, once the war ended, they basically found themselves in a regime largely controlled by the Northerners. So, for example, one unsentimental and
Interesting.
perhaps somewhat critical perspective to look at it was that South Vietnam, as as an entity, as a cultural entity, as a geographic entity, it was conquered by the North Vietnam. And even though South Vietnamese were participating in communist guerrillas, fighting for the communists, they kind of found themselves sidelined and found and played no position in governance because it were Northerners who took all the power and all the glory. So perhaps South Vietnamese communists, they most of all probably felt cheated.
Interesting. Interesting.
Are there
Kenny?
any? I think I agree with you when you're saying that the U.S. has many, many steps to go before it would look like anything like Russia or other authoritarian governments. Are there any other governmental models out there that the U.S. might be a better analog for where the U.S. is heading? Like I know sometimes you compare it to like the South American countries. Is that fair or accurate in your mind, or?
Good question, good question. I think in some regards, US may be pretty unique uh, in many respects. Like historically, for the several past centuries, it was uniquely rich, uniquely safe. I mean, like from the foreign invasions or like from any kind of foreign enemy. And generally speaking, what I think formed the US mindset and political culture and culture overall, it is a feeling of like infinite abundance of resources. Like in the beginning, it was kind of very like in physical way. So imagine if you're coming from like overcramped Europe, when you have to toil many, many years and perhaps you'll earn a plot of land, but probably not. And you're coming to the US and you can basically just take it like for free, almost for free. So, and what happens as a result in this model is that you have much lower intensity of conflict. So, for example, let's say in France, which is overcramped and has dozens of millions of people on a small plot of land, if you really, really need this land, you probably need to kill someone or displace or do something with them. And in the US, you can just go further west. And this pioneer spirit and expansionist spirit, which is often seen as spirit of enterprise and whatever, it also kinda allowed to go with much lower intensity and much less of inescapable conflicts that normally existed in the old world, where just everything was so cramped that overall strife and struggle was much more bitter. And
Now,
I would say,
Russia.
yeah.
Go ahead.
And I would say that you can also see the same in the US meritocracy, for example. So, for example, for a new fresh migrant, it's very much easier to come to the US and just do something than in most of the old world countries.
Hmm.
And part of the reason being, it's not just that culture is pro innovation or pro entrepreneurship. It's also for another reason. There is this reason that there is infinite abundance of resources and it will be enough for everyone. And in many other countries, there is no feeling that will be enough for everyone. So very often you will be like sabotaged and like shunned away by locals, and not because they're evil or xenophobic, but because there is like limited amount of the communal garden, and we cannot allow everyone in. So that is also what a great reason of the social dynamism in the US. It's the feeling that there will be enough resources for everyone.
I think that you talk about this sort of idea of the expanse of land and resources, and it makes me think of Russia because Russia obviously is a very physically vast country, but at the same time, much of Russia that we see on the globe is not a desirable place to live, right? It's not a place where you could farm or have a good life. It's not a quality land in that way. So is Russia more like these other old world countries as far as feeling cramped? Or is there that sense that you can spread out and make your own place?
It's interesting, really. It's interesting. I think is that yes, part of the reason, part of how it's similar, may look similar to the US, is that it's simply big, and there is potentially, like, there was always a chance to escape somewhere far away. In this regard, yes. How it is not similar? Well, the US, apart from just a lot of land, it also have a great and a lot of access to ocean. So there is this feeling of kind of openness to trade, openness to commerce, and like abundance that commerce brings, which had not been the case in Russia historically. So, partially for geographic reasons, much of Russia it was sort of like cut off from international commerce, and that, of course, like laid its, I would say, it certainly made an effect on how things develop. I would say, if I were to formulate like a mechanisms of expansion of Russia, very often it looked like this. There is like this overcramped territory where farmers and agriculturists live in very cramped conditions, and they are also extracted by the state, which kind of taxes them and forces them to do like forced labor and whatever. Then some of them, they kind of run away, like further away, and colonize lands further away. But when they do this, state comes and establishes the same conditions as like existed previously. So now you need to either accept them or to run further away still. So the paradox is that very often it was escape of agriculturalists from the Russian state that contributed to the expansion of the same state.
Makes sense. It's a fairly cynical way to see the government too, as very extractive more than, say, providing security or any kind of value for the people. Maybe that is the case. I don't know.
We've been talking a bit about an American mindset, how it's different than the Russian mindset. How do you think those two different mindsets maybe compare and contrast to say the Chinese mindset? Because they certainly have a very different way of viewing the world than we do in America. Um, and I know this is like I know I know you read the Chinese classics. I've seen you quote them in your essays. What do you think of the Chinese mindset?
Honestly, although I lived in China for like 2 years, I cannot say I understand China or I know China well. Maybe I saw bits of it. I do not speak Chinese. I was too lazy to really like bring it to any good level. So my like at my best, I could maybe sustain dialogue for like 3-4 minutes, but that was the top of it. Then I would just run out of words. So if you really want to talk with China experts, that's probably should be someone else. Like a great example would be like China Talk, Jordan Schneider. Unlike me, he actually mastered the language. So I just can offer some like scattered impressions. But overall, if I were to summarize one difference of Chinese minds, for example, from American one, is that overall there is less sense of existential security. There is an idea that you can actually fail, and the failure is much more absolute. So even like in individual terms. So I know that in America, China is often like branded as like communist or socialist. Uh, there may be an element of truth in that because China has strong elements of central planning in the economy. But when it comes to individuals, and even when it comes to businesses, even when it comes to companies, you often have much more ruthless and much more like merciless Darwinian competition, even between businesses, than what you have in the United States. So overall, I think the US has been such a rich country for so long that there is some great feeling of existential security, including for individuals. China, I think it very much depends. So, one reason, for example, why Americans go abroad to do businesses or study or to hustle in whatever kinds of ways, why America becomes mm, relatively more like isolated and kind of self-secluded is that the country is rich enough and the overall network of support is rich enough that you kind of can do it at home. uh Chinese, very often they are basically forced to be more enterprising. They just don't have a choice.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Very interesting. I know we've been going about an hour. Kenny, is it okay if I ask one more thing on the Russia front?
Please, yeah.
Yeah, so this is, I guess, from my perspective, looking at the US and the Cold War, I think America actually has, it's going to sound funny. I think America has a lot of romantic feelings toward Russia. I think we admire Russians a lot, and even though it's this very alien culture, we also see, kind of like you were saying, Russians see Ukrainians as being similar. I think Americans, in some way, see Russians as having a relation to themselves, whether or not that's true, and being a great literary culture, a culture of dance, of fine art. And I think that, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we expected Russia to become more like the US. And obviously, that didn't really happen. Do you think that Russia could still become more like the US? And if not, where do you think Russia will go, say, after Putin? What happens to Russia culturally?
Well, my premise and kind of my theoretical assumption that I will base my response upon is that I believe that political structures, they pursue primarily pride and glory. That is like the main metrics they optimize. I mean, individuals, they very often optimize this too, but individuals kind of are more restrained. So maybe you just start pursuing pride and glory and then you run out of money or whatever. And that happens very often. Or you start pursuing pride and glory and then you get to jail. Countries, and especially big countries, they just have less constraints. So what I expect Russian political leadership to do, and that does not really depend much upon specific leadership, is to pursue pride and glory and kind of maximize that metrics. Wherever it will lead, well, it very much depends. It's difficult to predict by this point.
That makes sense. That makes
Pride
sense.
and glory. Well, I mean,
Yeah.
that's usually a pretty good selling point in U.S. political campaigns. So
And
I think
these things, these
Uh,
webs of
I think that
alliances
the
can
US,
change so fickly.
yes, but I also think that the US, they're formed by a very unique set of circumstances that
Mm.
were very rare in global history. And I do not think that anything like that is going to happen in Russia or in Eastern Europe, like in the foreseeable future. So if it becomes more Americanized, then probably just only in a way of kind of chaotic and unregulated and maybe unstoppable diffusion of American memes. And American memes, I don't mean only art or like memes like internet memes, but all sort of memes. So by this point, I think nothing probably Americanized global culture as much as TikTok. So there is obviously like diffusion of American culture and like of therapy speak or whatever, of everything. But that does not mean that political or economic structure per se will become like in the United States. That I do not believe in.
there's a deep irony that a Chinese-made app has become a platform and a vector for the American culture to. Well, it kind of turning into global culture, I guess, at this point. Um, I've always felt that with information technology kind of becoming increasingly ubiquitous, this openness to like the transmission of different ideas in memes. It's an interesting like social experiment. On the one hand, it feels like it's eroding the parts of our culture that the 20th century kind of took for granted, and now we're heading into uncharted waters, which might end up great, might not end up great at all. It might end up pretty bad. I couldn't predict it, but I look at other parts of the world like China and to a lesser extent Europe, where they're, especially China, where the flow of ideas and information is, if not completely controlled, let's just say being monitored and in some cases actively suppressed. And I wonder if it's almost like if you go back to memes as if they're almost like an infective virus, at least that model of thinking about memes and culture, it's like I find myself building up my own like immunities to disinformation and propaganda. I find that like if I thought about how, if I recall like back to like the way I looked at and consumed information, say 10 years ago in 2015, and think about how much more skeptical and more aware I am now of how information flows. And I think I'm building up my immunity to meme transmission. I wonder like what will happen to other societies that aren't as open down the road if they ever do become open, and if they're going to have a mass infection. At least in the U.S., we get to build our immunities piecemeal. Like every time like AI slot bots get better, you don't get like twice as good overnight. They're like 10% better, and so like our immune systems can catch up. And I
But
wonder what will
is
happen.
there such thing, Kenny, as a non-open community anymore? I mean, even I feel like teenagers, even like in rural Afghanistan, are like scrolling TikTok. I don't know if there are any enclaves from open information in 2025.
Mhm. I think maybe how it really, in which way I think countries, for example, like Russia, can be really different from the United States. Not even in sense that there is no open information, because in reality, like everyone has a smartphone, almost everyone. I think they may different. They may be different in another way. In Russia, it's like transition of power is less smooth. So the generational transition of power between generations is also less smooth because it's just, for example, like obviously pretty much every major country in the world, it kind of has a problem with gerontocracy. But in the US, if you don't want to go, you very often still will have to go at some point. And in Russia, you will have more leverage to just keep your office. So basically, in countries like Russia, it's much more normal for the entire generation in power to just live as long as they live and die in their offices. In the US, it happens, but happens less, which means that generational transition in countries like Russia, it is often becoming much more like Thunderbolt-like. So basically, like the one club of people takes power, they become 50, 60, 70, 80, then they like die within several years, all of them. And then, but these people, because they're afraid to lose power, they basically threw away or sidelined all people just a little bit younger than themselves because they considered them to be a threat. So they kept people much younger than themselves, maybe like 15 years younger.
Right.
And what happens is that immediately and without any intermediary, like one generation it is succeeded by much younger generation, which was formed in different circumstances and which absorbed different memes in their formative years. So, for example, when we're talking about Russia now and how it's influenced by American memes, it is younger generations. So obviously, like Putin and those around him, they're 70s, they don't care. I don't think they're using internet much. But when they all die, and they will die at some point, they'll be succeeded probably by like 50-year-old something that were already formed in different circumstances.
Interesting. Slowly and then all at once, I guess is the phrase. These things can just sort of turn. Very curious to see how that goes with the soft power. It's funny, you don't really know which way it's flowing. Is it flowing out of the US? Is it flowing into the US? I guess it's decentralized. All I know is that Americans grow up wanting to be celebrities, so maybe that turns them into little decentralized agents of soft power as they shoot their vertical videos and, try to get their little piece of fame all over
The
the
modern
world.
term for celebrities is influencer, Cairo.
Yeah, that's right. Micro celebrities. Exactly. An entire culture of micro celebrities. I don't know. Do Russian people grow up wanting to be famous?
Yes,
Yes.
And yes, obviously, yes. And interestingly enough, at this point, and specifically in Putin's era, probably this desire increased because if we are talking about 2000s, 2010s in Putin's era, becoming like a blogger, becoming a YouTuber, then becoming a TikToker, it was seen as kind of alternative way to social advancement, alternating of all the existing like structures of power, and in this respect, it became kind of highly desirable. And overall, it was not liked very much by the state and by the political establishment, largely because it was considered something of a hack. No, 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 that's not how you earn status. You earn status getting some job, some kind of employment. Then maybe if we let you, rising like year by year, stage by stage, and then maybe by the age of 60, you'll have some authority.
Right.
So, but were these careers of like internet celebrities desirable? Yeah, absolutely, yes.
It's almost a way for a generation to create. You know what it is, just to tie into what we were talking about earlier. You were talking about how there's a lower intensity of violence in America because instead of fighting to the death for land, people could go west. Becoming a YouTuber or a TikToker is almost like the generational power version of going west, you know? Like if there are old professors or government ministers who are refusing to let your generation advance and gain power, you could fight them to take over the broadcasting company, or you could just go west into TikTok and YouTube and create your own land, and that seems like almost what's happening sometimes. As the old people hang on to the old institutions, you have young people like building new places where they can run things their way. I don't know. That's the thought that came into my head.
I agree, and I also think that for a number of reasons and cultural institutional reasons, this is probably a paradise to be an influencer or something like that. And there may be a sort of paradox in that, because many influencers, like political influencers, like on the left or on the right, they often tend to dislike the overall like regime, the overall like structure of power in the United States. And many of them may prefer, or they think they prefer, some more like strongman systems of power. But in reality, I think that influencers are doing the best under the bourgeois regimes. So nobody really likes plutocracy, but under more like plutocratic, more oligarchic regimes, influencers and podcasters, they have much more authority and much more impact than under like one big strongman. So in Russia, it was very visible in 1990s when like the power was weak and there were like many factions competing for power, and there were like many oligarchs, and all of them wanted to be important. I would say, of course, internet did not really like blow up back then, but I mean, sort of like public intellectuals and journalists and media figures, they could be important back then. But when one strongman came and like concentrated all the power for himself, no. Now the golden age of public intellectuals or whatever ended. So paradoxically enough, people like podcasters and influencers, they are doing best when power is more distributed.
Interesting. Do you find your audience personally is mostly in the West, or where do you find your readership comes from?
Well, until 2022, it was like I was writing in Russian, and it was obviously mostly from Soviet Union.
Right.
Then I switched to English. I cannot say that I have like full or 100% picture, especially regarding like where people live. It may not 100% reflect who they are ethnically. So even if I see locations, it does not tell everything. But yes, I would say mostly it is the North America and Europe, two primary audiences.
Makes sense. That makes sense. And I'm sorry that I don't know this. Do you work within academia as well as writing in new media on Substack, etc.?
No, for many years, no.
Okay, I see. And how has this process been for you as this new kind of public intellectual? writing, blogging? I mean,
Yeah.
what
I
has the journey been like?
Speaking of
No, I absolutely
influencers,
love it. I absolutely love independence.
Mm.
When I was contributing to newspapers and to medias, and I did it for years, I always found the control of editors a little bit stifling, to be honest. So, just not to sound rude or anything, but basically you contribute an article, and another person want some changes, and they give some kind of headline you would never give, and it goes with some headline which is like you do not even think it really represents your idea. I mean, I had to deal with that, but I never really liked it. So to be like fully in control, it's much more pleasant to me. It's much more liberating, and also it gives me much more freedom just to pursue, let's say, micro research I'm genuinely interested in.
it does feel like the golden age of Substack is what we're living through right now. And speaking of influencers, I guess all three of us, in our way, are playing a similar game on a different platform through a different medium.
Yes,
I
but I
guess
also
so.
think the thing you are doing, like in terms of podcast, it's very right and correct. Because although we may be living through the golden age of podcast, but overall, I believe that the culture will becoming more and more oral. So for
Hmm.
broader outreach, probably I feel I'll be needing to focus more on audiovisual content.
Yes, I guess we'll see how things unfold. It's certainly an interesting environment. Sometimes I ask myself if I want to go back and do, a PhD or something, study in the humanities, but honestly, I feel like so much of the culture is being decided online. It's like the time that I would spend to get a graduate degree, I could be engaging with people here, online, moving the culture forward. It's exciting. I find it exciting.
I agree. I have been reading like recently, like Tocqueville, Notes on French Revolution, and there was a moment, there was an episode I really, really liked. So basically, straight before the revolutionary events unfolded, French clergy, so basically priests, they're demanding more and harder censorship. Why? Because they know there is a lot of atheist propaganda and like anti-God, anti-church propaganda going on, and they demand a crackdown upon them all. And what is interesting, they demand crackdown against the book, against the books, against the book printing only. So kind of newspapers, they are not mentioned at all. They just ignore them completely. Why? Most probably because they think it's just so low and unimportant. Like TikTok. So books, that is kind of
Yeah.
legend. Books, that is serious. And that is something we really need to be concerned about. But newspapers, that's like so lowly, that's like completely irrelevant. But in reality, as we know, it was the newspapers that really like guided the course of events and drive them, not the books. So probably there is some kind of inverse correlation between the actual impact, and I mean like societal impact, intellectual impact, and the status and symbolic hierarchy. So although people
And
tend to
there's
presume that it is the high genres that are the most important, perhaps it is the low
yes.
genres that are.
And the status or the esteem of a medium doesn't necessarily correlate with the potency of its persuasive power. Like if there was a very controversial, I don't know, say like there was like a pro-fascist book published in the US, right? Like obviously there would be a whole lot of the elites would like try to um, get this book off the shelves at like Barnes and Noble or whatever. But a pro-fascist like meme is probably more powerful than a book in terms of like, a pro-fascist TikTok in terms of like having a psychological effect on young people, I would say, even though it would get less attention from the establishment. Yeah, it's funny. Do you have any plans to ever make TikToks yourself? I guess first we'll do the podcast and then maybe we'll start doing some Kamil TikToks. Huh?
I think TikTok is probably not my genre. I think I'll focus on the longer form.
Fair enough. If your content is hitting the right people, they will make TikToks summarizing what you made, right? They'll do the
Um,
work.
I think that would be absolutely great.
Mm,
It's like there's a whole supply chain, if you will, of
exactly.
this, and sometimes I feel like it's rare in like short form like tweets and in TikTok that it's like the truly innovative revolutionary ideas coming out. And it's usually like someone wrote a long form essay about it somewhere, and other people wrote about it, and then that gets translated to bit by bit, more and more direct, digestible, smaller bite sizes. At least
Yeah.
that's, I don't
Yes,
know if
and I
that's
wouldn't
always
dismiss
true,
the
but
books either. I wouldn't dismiss books either because I'm quite sure, like I agree with that was Nassim Taleb's thought that actually
mm,
um, one book it produces much greater impact than if the same material is presented as a series of articles. So that is
very,
what us stackers must keep in mind.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Yes, I think the most influential political theory bloggers I know eventually compiled their essays into a book. So maybe there are different ways to go about that. Kenny, we've been running a little long, so I think we should probably wind it down, but I wanted to make sure there was nothing else you wanted to get into before we wrap it up.
I think this has been great. Yeah, I think I'm sure there's many more tangents we could go down. I think Kyra, you and I and Camille were men of varied and diverse interests, and so we could probably keep talking for a few more hours. But maybe we'll save that for a follow up installment
Yeah.
down the
Yeah.
road.
Okay, so thank
I know.
you.
I definitely think we could bring Camille back. I want to make sure, Camille, that people know if they were interested in what you had to say. Where can people go to read your work? How can they find you online?
I think the easiest of all just to go to my Substack, Kamil Kazani Substack.com, or perhaps on Twitter.
Okay, excellent. Well, that's nice and sweet, and we will include those links in the description as well. So if you are listening on Spotify, if you are listening on Apple Music, if you are on YouTube, go check out futuristletters.com. You can find the links in the description of this episode. I also want to say to our dear listeners and watchers, thank you very much for tuning in. If you want to sponsor the show, you can search advertise on Futurist Letters on our site or click the link on the side, send us an email, and we would be happy to have you as a sponsor. If you'd like to become a paid subscriber, you can tune into our after show episode where Kenny and I talk about how the episode went. So we are, in fact, going to have one of those right now. So please do even take out a trial, throw us a few bucks, and join Kenny and myself for that after show episode where we talk about really whatever's on our minds and give you a little bit more of this conversation. But Camille, thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
coming on. It was a pleasure having you. I do think we could easily get many, many more hours out of you, but we appreciate you taking the time. And we will see you around the internet.
Mhm. So, have a good day and thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, guys.